Okay, everybody, welcome back. This is our final speaker before lunch. This is Greg Miller from the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation, and he's here to talk to you about the TrustTheVote project. I think this is really exciting, and that's why I invited him to come speak here. There's a lot of really cool stuff here, and I felt that it was important that for a San Francisco Ruby conference, we have some talks that weren't just about how to do stuff, but why we do it and why we're all in this business. And part of that's making a big impact on the world. And this is someone who's out to do that. So thanks very much. Give a hand for Greg Miller.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I do realize that I'm standing between you and lunch. So without further ado, have a look.
There was a time when we believed it all worked just fine. We chose candidates, cast our votes, and votes were tabulated with sufficient accuracy. And though we might be disappointed with the outcome of an election, we believed the process was trustworthy. But since the 2000 election, that trust has eroded. Now voting systems rest on shaky ground, with the stability of American democracy at risk. Back in 2002, in an effort to restore trust in the electoral process, the Help America Vote Act became law, which gave states funding to update their voting systems with computerized devices. Fast forward to the present. Proprietary computers are increasingly used, whether as touchscreen voting machines or electronically counted paper ballots. And the result? Although we have found a way past the hanging chad, we're seeing not fewer, but more problems. Lost votes, no way to recount, and even security concerns that invite election fraud. And yet there is little chance these machines are going away, or that their transparency will improve, or that their operation will be more trustworthy. Adopting digital voting systems is profitable for companies that make and sell them. But when these same companies considered the development costs required to make their products truly trustworthy, they realized the investment would not pencil out for their required profitability. And so, these companies essentially settled for PC-grade technology with their own programs to create proprietary voting machines. So what about us? What about the millions of Americans who vote? What about our individual investment in the integrity of our public elections? We can no longer be content to simply exercise our right to vote. We need to trust that our votes will count. Shouldn't we, the people, require that something be done to protect our personal stake in our democracy? Shouldn't each one of us be able to say with utmost certainty, I count? Since our vested interest in democracy is at stake, we need to lead change. We cannot and should not expect the private sector or government to fix this problem. This needs to be a grassroots movement, where we, the participants in this democracy, rebuild trust in the process of elections. And faced with technology increasingly used to cast our votes, we need to do something big. Completely rethink the life cycle of our ballots. We need to shift away from private companies guarding the secrecy of proprietary software and move toward a transparent, open source approach. We need to move away from a world of black box voting to a world of glass box voting, where designs are publicly reviewed. Technology is openly analyzed and refined. Blueprints are freely available. And where we ensure our electoral process is trustworthy, we need the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation. OSDV is not just another think tank doing a study, and it's not lobbying politicians for change. OSDV is a movement composed of technology professionals teaming up with a virtual community of volunteers. This team is building open source digital voting devices available for everyone to see, touch, and try. and they're using a proven approach. Think about the Firefox Internet web browser. It's a great example of how people came together to create an open source solution to allow unbridled access to information everywhere. The OSDV project takes the same approach for something even more imperative: trustworthy election systems for future generations of American voters. This is a digital public works project calling upon people from all corners of the country, people like you and me, who can contribute our creativity and common sense, as well as our time and support. It's a hands-on movement for everyone who believes they count. So if you believe that how you cast your vote is just as important as who you vote for, then you can help. There's much to be done, but we can do this. Through the OSDV, we, the real stakeholders in our democracy, can help ensure that all our votes count. And the time to begin is now.
So, it wouldn't be any fun, and we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't make you work a little before you get your food, so we planned a bit of a pop quiz for you. Some true or false questions for you. So, federal guidelines for how votes are counted, true or false? You're right. There are no federal guidelines for how votes are counted, and that's the principal reason we have as many problems as we have today. Let's try another one. California's absentee ballots are always counted. We've got a great crowd here. This will be an easy recruiting mission. You're absolutely right. Just because you file a ballot in California timely and with all the things that you're supposed to do, there's no assurance that it'll be counted. All right, one more. Believe it or not, it's true, right? Major voting vendors are actually using nothing more than commodity, off-the-shelf hardware and software today. True or false? Well, sort of. It turns out, and what these guys are using is Windows 95. Now, wait. It's not all that bad. I mean, look at it this way. We get great applications. We get Clippy. Right? Now, there's obviously absurdity in this. And we have discovered in this project that's now been underway for about 2 years that there is some enormous dysfunction in the marketplace for voting systems. In fact, the free market experiment that was made possible by the HAVA Act in 2002, when the previous administration tried to right the wrongs of the debacle in Florida, that very act, the Help America Vote Act, was supposed to lead us away from the hanging chad, provide more trust in the system, but it did anything but. In fact, the problem is that this free market experiment in its failure really couldn't have been avoided. You see, this is a horribly dysfunctional, malformed market. There is absolutely no competition. There are 4 vendors, ladies and gentlemen, 4 vendors doing voting systems in America today. A handful of smaller folks trying to do things. But in terms of voting systems vendors who have the ability to provide a full voting system solution to a state that a state recognizes and can acquire, there's 4 of them. And that may be 2 by the end of this year. There's also very high barriers to entry. There's no incentive to have a new person enter this business because you have this process of certification. Millions of dollars to get your system certified so that it can be approved and literally be legal for states to acquire. And as a result, when you have very little competition, very high barriers to entry, you know the drill from econ, you have no incentive to innovate. In fact, what we have found is there is a perverse disincentive to innovate. So if you're worried about Windows 95 as the principal platform for these voting machines, consider that the Z80 chip is still the most popular piece of hardware that is used out there in counting devices. I kid you not. So what happens? We end up with closed proprietary systems with lots of inconsistencies and irregularities, and we have a natural conflict of interest. And by that I mean, when you give the private sector the responsibility for producing something so imperative to our democracy, literally the cornerstone of our democracy, you have a train wreck of shareholder interests colliding with the public interest. And unfortunately, there's fiduciary duty for those businesses. They have to maximize the return on investment for their shareholders. It means where a shareholder interest meets a public interest, guess who wins every time? So in examining this, we realize we really have to think different. I mean, really different. It is not a situation, it's no longer tenable for the private sector to be trying to do this. It's not a good business for them to be in. It really isn't. We need to start thinking about things in terms of what we call critical democracy infrastructure. This stuff is really, truly the cornerstone of our democracy. It is the pillar on which we have democracy. And the substance of that pillar today is technology. So in order to really advance that concept of critical democracy infrastructure, there is no doubt, I don't think there's any doubt in this room, that transparency becomes the cornerstone. We have to build transparency instead. Justice Brandeis said it wonderfully once, that sunlight is the best disinfectant you can have. So if we bring transparency into the system, to do so, we really ought to think about this as critical democracy infrastructure that has transparency as a digital public works project. It's critical democracy infrastructure, whether it's the electric grid or whether it's highways or waterways. If we start thinking in the mentality that this stuff is so imperative, so essential to the preservation of our democratic process, then it needs to be lifted up to a level of visibility that constitutes a public works project. So people ask us all the time, well, why not the commercial sector? I mean, if you mandate transparency and you give them the wherewithal, wouldn't they do it? Well, the problem is, as I suggested earlier, you're going to end up with black box solutions. You have to, because intellectual property is the means by which they protect their business model. You're going to have these continued barriers to entry. You're going to have the money issue of return on investment, so they're going to do as little as possible to give you a good solution. And finally, as I said earlier, you're going to have those shareholder interests. So why not the government sector? Well, it turns out that if we ask the government sector to do this, we end up twisting in the political winds of appropriation. In other words, they decided to fund something this year, but next year, due to budget cuts or political winds, they're no longer funding it. So the project becomes unsustainable. So, next slide. So in thinking about our solution, the approach that the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation is taking with what we call the TrustTheVote project is to eliminate the lack of transparency by doing everything on the principles of open source. We want to eliminate the inconsistent behaviors and irregularities in the system by working towards fault tolerance. So we're bringing together two very diverse approaches to software development, the very disciplined hierarchical approach of fault tolerant or high assurance computing, together with the organized chaos and wonders of the open source development environment. And finally, to eliminate that conflict of interest, to get the shareholders and the public interest working together again, the project has to be nonprofit. And the notion here then is to actually build things. So rather than being a think tank going to Washington saying, if we could just get this legislation passed, we could do X, we've got a group of guys down the Silicon Valley and girls who are literally building stuff that, as Senator Patrick Leahy directed us a year ago, we can see, touch, and try. So we're literally making things. And to get there, we have a development process that centers around what we call a core team. So we are fairly spiritually aligned with some friends of ours at the Mozilla Foundation. We're sharing a lot of processes, we're sharing some technology, we're sharing some thinking. And what we realize is that a core team is essential to continue the continuity of the project and keep marshaling it. So our CTO is currently building the core team. Wrapped around the core team is a request for comment service. So very similar to how the IETF works, the Internet Engineering Task Force, we have a request for comment service that allows us to essentially broadcast out principles, business requirements, if you will, of how these systems ought to work. The big idea behind this, and what no other effort in the country is doing right now, is that we have assembled, or in the process of forming, something called a Design Congress. You see, we went out and we figured out who the real stakeholders are in the system. Because as much as we would like to think it's you or I, unless it's a close election, it probably isn't. But it is the stakeholders who make the decisions about what systems to implement. So we've gathered together the state elections directors from around the country in a virtual community and have asked them to help drive the business requirements so that we can ensure that there's a possibility of some adoption for what we're building. They participate in the request for comment service. Their feedback allows us to then develop design specifications. The design specifications, of course, then drive the technology. And then the linchpin here is that our foundation is undertaking the process of actually getting this work federally certified. Then it can be fully adopted. We now have the Design Congress, the states on the top who've said, yep, I've driven the business requirements for this technology, and the bottom side has passed through NIST for the certification. All that is deposited into a public technology repository, which is the other half of the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation's work. An endowment's being put together to actually create a sustainable internet archive, if you will. And this archive is built upon those draft standards and specifications in the database. And then we layer on top of that a data service layer to drive the two big principles of our project, voter registration and voting systems and services. We have a public test harness on that, and that drives our certification processes. The great news is that we're already working with folks at NIST, with computer scientists there, who quite frankly are rather giddy about the notion of having an open source architecture that they could build test suites for, and perhaps even go so far as to do dynamic continuous testing of modules as they're added to the trees. We then have a licensing layer on there of a public development license and a commercial deployment license that allows us to actually deliver to commercial vendors who are actually deploying systems out in the states, such as EDS, for example. Takes the commercial deployment license to that and literally goes and delivers to the states what the states are then, through the Design Congress, asking them to do, which is to deliver to them open source solutions that are predicated upon these draft standards that the consortium is building. We have 5 major work areas that you might be interested in. Our digital voter registration system is the one that's probably the most advanced right now, but others are catching up rather quickly. We have a ballot design studio. So another big aspect of the voting ecosystem is the design of ballots. If you think about the things that tend to cause breakdowns in the system, voter registrants, are they registered to vote? Are they allowed to vote? Did they vote? And were the ballots provisional? Were they accurate? Were they acceptable? How did the design work for them? We've seen in a lot of instances studying this over the last 2 years that a lot of times it just simply was how the ballots were designed. We're working with the American Institute of Graphic Artists, the AIGA, with some work they did at the Brennan Law Center for the federal government on guidelines for ballot design to create a web-based studio so the states who actually have people who work to design and lay out ballots every year can connect with the studio and start designing ballots that are running against the AIGA standards. Ballot casting and counting systems, of course, that's the big one. That's the one that gets all the Clegg lights and attention. That's really examining how the ballots are cast and how they are counted. A big, rather complex project. Our CTO is here today. You can talk to at lunch about it. Election management services is a whole collection of the service layer that has all the back-end processes that go with an ecosystem. And finally, we have an operating system platform project. Really unsexy, boring stuff unless you love kernels and drivers. But we're really starting over with a Linux-based kernel on which we'll build the ballot casting and counting platforms. And here's the good news. The good news is that a good portion of our work is Rails-based. And so we thought that might be of interest to you, or at least get your ears up, tail on a slow wag, I hope. But Rails is a big part of what we're doing, and that's why we thought it'd be a good idea to come and tell you about this project. This project has been intentionally under the radar for the last couple of years because some of our major backers, such as Mitch Kapor, the Kapor Foundation, wanted to make certain that we could actually achieve what we want to do, that we could actually build this and we can actually assemble a great team. So John's core team is people like Pito Salas, who ran the notes division at Lotus for years, the inventor of the pivot table and spreadsheets. We just had Alexander Totix join us. You probably know that name as one of the original 7 at Netscape Communications, my alma mater. So we're starting to assemble a really very cool core team of some great people to drive this stuff. Rails is a part of that. Pivotal Labs is one of our development partners that's been working with us on some of the digital voter registration services. So in conclusion, I think the point is we're here to tell you about this project and let you know that in the coming weeks you're going to see it come above the radar as we now are taking this whole thing public. We sort of started here today with this video that we're going to throw up on the web. There's certainly a couple of websites for you to go look at. We've got several of us here today that would be glad to talk with you during lunch, but I really wanted to make sure I could beat that 12:30 deadline for you. So unless there's any big questions, I'd like to say thanks for listening and look forward to meeting you all. Question?
Is there any thought that to also changing the algorithm by which we choose winners given a set of votes? For instance, trying to look for a counter set winner as opposed to simple majority?
So the question is there any thought being given to how we advance or improve the system as it is? Let me say a couple things about that because it's a great question. So on the one hand, the Foundation's mandate is, yes, to look over the horizon at what does next generation voting technology look like. Things such as that, things such as instant runoff voting, et cetera, et cetera. Alex Totek has worked quite a bit on the IRV stuff. But there's another half of this question you need to understand. What we didn't want to do was develop the perfect system that ended up becoming a relic in the Smithsonian as the system that woulda, shoulda, coulda, but never did. We actually want to be the change that we're being asked to be. And to do that means that we have to get adoption for what we're doing. And it is a process. To get there, we have to be driven by real requirements and real uses. Believe me, if you were to ask me off record, I have quite a bit to say about how I think the system that's very balkanized and very distributed works or doesn't work. But there's lots of groups out there trying to change that. What we believe is that technology itself, we in this room have the power to make the change happen by making stuff that people can see, touch, and try. And you do that by taking what is the existing processes, like them or not, and say, just those existing processes, there's a lot of things we could do to fix, block and tackle stuff right now. And when you do that, you get their attention. And when you get their attention, then more change begins. But rather than throwing stones at the walls on the outside, we've decided to go in and be the termites underneath.
Are you using the hardware designs and the interface designs also part of the open source?
So the question is, will hardware designs and interface designs be part of the open source? Everything, absolutely everything we're doing, including even brand new GPL licensing structures so that the government can actually legally take a license to this technology, another whole conversation, all of it will be funneled through the RFC process and done in a transparent fashion. Specifically with regards to UI and hardware, let me say this. John's goal today, our CTO's goal today, is to build an entire software ecosystem that runs against a known, clean, virgin, commodity hardware layer. Once you prove that, once you have that running, then the next step of the Foundation, as our founders and our backers envision it, is that we are going to begin and go in and examine on a device-by-device basis, starting to plug in new hardware architecture for new task-specific devices. And yes, that implies open source hardware. Never been done, but we have folks like Intel and AMD joining us to help and examine how that might be.
There has to be a lot of obstacles for this, a lot of border obstacles. There's no standardization across states right now. We've got a lot of politicians that are interested in disenfranchising people who don't actually want ineffective voting systems in some cases. Those are just my opinion. What are some of the obstacles we're facing and how are you handling them?
So, what are the obstacles we are facing and how are we handling them? Boy, there are tons of obstacles. But here's what we know. There are lots of people out there who are policy experts, great lobbyists, people who are seeking change from a legislative perspective. We're taking a very strong position that we are technologists, and we're trying to bring together the best and the brightest technologists together to work on the actual technical pieces. Senator Patrick Leahy and I met about a year ago, and he said to me, he took me aside during the Internet Caucus's State of the Internet address out there. We were showing off technology, and he said, listen, please don't waste anyone's time trying to change systems. Go make things that people can see, touch, and try. Those were his words. We're using them. He said, you know, if somebody had come to me a few years ago and said, Senator, what if I could put a device in your hands that would allow you to instantly track developments on the web, legislation, instantly get a hold of your staff, watch tickers, be able to message people while you're there in chambers? I could bring all that information in your hands. Wouldn't that be a great device to have? And he said, my response to him would have been, yeah, but don't bother. Because franking rules notwithstanding, I don't have a regulatory structure in my chamber to allow such a device to be used here. He said instead, what happened was somebody went off and built this device that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of millions of people started using every day. And one day, around the chamber, we noticed our staff started showing up with these things called BlackBerries. And once the devices were in people's hands, and they could actually see, touch, and try how things could be, it was remarkable how rapidly rules began to change to fit that technology. As to politicians wanting to disenfranchise, we have discovered some horrifying, just horrifying ways that the system is built to preserve the incumbency. Again, I have not met one politician who will publicly say this is a bad idea. Inside, they're hoping that this just doesn't work, because they know that if it does, it really does change the landscape in a big way. And so what we believe, and the reason we're here, is that a lot of people are spending millions of people's dollars to go stand on Capitol Hill and lobby people for change and write position papers and do all this stuff. And that's important work. But I think we have all learned over the past 10 years, especially with the commercialization of the Internet, that nothing fosters change like real working technology.
What percentage of elections around the country do you think are corrupt, such that this would actually change the correct process?
The question was, do I have a guesstimate on the percentage of corruption in elections around the country? Strong word. And in the last 2 years that we've been doing a lot of due diligence, if you will, and making sure we can do what we want to do, we have found some remarkable irregularities and inconsistencies. Some of them have risen to the level of criminal investigations, if you're following Ohio. We've seen 3 major debacles, right? And in fact, people say today, well, wait a minute, everything worked out. President Obama was elected, things went well, right? You have no idea how we dodged a bullet this year. And oh, by the way, if you haven't noticed, we are 170 days into the congressional session with no senator from Minnesota seated. Okay? Nothing's fixed. We've just dodged a bullet. And if we don't get started now doing it, whether or not we know what's corrupt, we have no chance of ensuring that we can at least stem off that possibility. Let me also say this, too. Please don't think, and I'm sure you don't, but just to kind of hit this point home, that just because we can go build great technology that we're going to fix those problems. Because what we're trying to do is by restoring trust to the technology, we remove that argument from the equation. No longer can the politician hide behind the computer and say, it was the box's fault. See all these reports? We can move that away and now expose that the problems are really about processes, social engineering, and human intent or malfeasance. I can take 2 more questions, maybe.
It seems like what you're doing is really, really complicated, perhaps for a problem that could be tackled more incrementally by doing less complicated things.
Okay, so the question is, it feels complex. It feels like we're boiling the ocean. Right. So we had this issue about componentizing our solution, and when we got started way back when, it was very much the feeling of some of the core group of our computer scientists and our backers and people, again, like Mitch Kapor, who said, the only way to do this right is to take a clean slate. Forget incumbency, forget legacy, and start clean. If you were to start clean over, what would you do? And one of the things we realized right away is that we needed open data, open processes. And so this goes all the way down to the data layer. And what we discovered in the ecosystem is that things are really very highly interconnected. From the voter registration process, through the design of ballots, through the casting and counting of them, to the back-end verification and summation of the process. So we've tried to partition that up into separate buckets. And we're chewing away at them with different people working on different buckets. The idea is that the data layer underneath it, XML-based, and with this new thing called Election Audit Markup Language, EAML, that we're working on, we're going to begin to lay the foundations so that many people can plug in the pieces to this framework over time. So we're not going to achieve this all at once. We're going at it in a procedural fashion. Voter registration right now, at least through 2010, is really the hottest topic for us. But in order to try to orchestrate that boil the ocean effect, and I encourage you to talk to our CTO, John Sebas, about this, there is an approach that the core team is taking to allow for a distributed amount of work to come back together. One more question. Is the video online? The one we just showed off. So this is the first public release of this production that a Hollywood company put together for us. And we're going to put up on our new website that's coming out soon and YouTube, and yes, it'll be widely available. The code for all the work that we're doing, absolutely. We have stuff sitting out at GitHub, I believe now. Are we doing anything? I might have been doing some stuff at SourceForge. No, everything's over in GitHub now. And then our wiki, of course, is full of stuff. As you might guess, we're doing a lot of work right now is in that specification RFC layer so we get the right stuff. But we're very keen, another thing for this audience, on the notion of mixing the agile development approaches in with that more structured approach. So some things we're doing rapid prototyping on, getting some iterations going, allowing our stakeholders to take a look at it. Other things we're taking a little bit more of a methodical approach to. Thank you all again.